So I logged onto Twitter and everyone was talking about adult content online. Should it be banned? What should be done about this whole thing?
What's to be done with this Homer Simpson?
My timeline was freaking out, exploding with all sorts of ideas and judgments about pornography. First things first, we're mostly talking about men viewing streaming video porn online. Women don't view as much porn, and as far as I understand it, it tends to be more erotic fiction. We're talking about men. That's who we kind of know about statistically. The majority of consumers of internet videos. Inside men is a mechanism. That mechanism will reward him with feel-good chemicals if he finds a woman and mates with her. And this mechanism is powerful. After all, if it wasn't powerful, we wouldn't be here today. Your father had this mechanism. His father had this mechanism. His father had this mechanism. You're descended from a line of thousands of men, and they all successfully found a woman and mated with her. They were all rewarded by this mechanism. Now, ultimately, we're animals. We experience the world through our senses. Men don't receive a reward. We don't get a chemical hit of feel-good when an egg is fertilized, right? Because we have no idea there's no way for us to know when the egg is fertilized. And in fact, the egg fertilization can be a long time after sex. Similarly, even if a man was spending time with his wife, who was infertile, there's no way for that mechanism to know that she's infertile. How the mechanism works is by preferring women who are likely to be fertile, right? Young, healthy looking. And if he can get her with her clothes off, right? Seeing the types of things that you would only normally get to see if you were her mate, and then you can achieve orgasm, well, that trips the mechanism. You know, we can't create mechanisms about actually fertilizing women. There's no way for that kind of mechanism to exist. We make a mechanism around the types of male behaviors that are likely to lead to fertilizing women, and then you just reward that over and over and over, knowing that eventually it'll happen. Now, people have found ways to pervert and abuse this mechanism for a long time now. I mean, just think about it. If you wanted to see the type of things that only a mate would normally see and achieve orgasm, how might you be able to do that without going through all the rigmarole of actually pairing up with a woman? How about peeping toms? Maybe a man sitting in a tree trying to view a woman? That's not that popular, especially when such easier ways to exist to scratch the itch. But peeping toms are functionally trying to cheat this mechanism. Here's a question. Now that internet pornography exists and is so highly available, do you think the incidences of peeping toms has gone down? Now, honestly, I can't find statistics on this. Maybe it's out there. I looked, couldn't find it. I don't think there's much in the way of statistics on peeping toms so often because it's not even dealt with criminally. And when it is, it's different in every country, different in each state. But if you were to guess, do you think peeping toms have gone down over the last few decades? It certainly seems to have gone down. It seems less in the public consciousness than it used to be. I hear people talking about it less. In the 1990s on television, it was mentioned. It was mentioned in movies. You could think back to movies in the 1970s and 80s. Animal House, that was a frequent joke. Young frat boys climbing trees, falling off ladders and roofs to try and catch a glimpse of something through an upper floor sorority window. Now, here's the thing. If voyeurism has gone down, like I suspect it is, what would that mean? What it would mean is men who would normally have urges that would push them to engage with real-life women, even sometimes in stupid ways like peeping, are instead indoors, alone, in a cycle of satisfying their mechanism to online content, right? We're replacing real-life activity with virtual activity. So the reality is inescapable. If there was no porn to satisfy the mechanism, men would take more real-life action to scratch the itch. Now, hopefully, that would be like girlfriends and wives, right? It would push men to do more real-life things, and if they found they had trouble getting a woman, let's say due to a personal flaw, they might seek to address that personal flaw. Maybe they have poor hygiene. Fix that, get the girl. It's a powerful drive. Remember, your father, his father, his father. It's an unbroken chain of thousands of men who pushed forward to make the magic happen. Certainly a shower isn't going to stop a young man from scratching the itch, is it? No, what might stop him from a relationship is being permanently satiated with a constant stream of internet porn.
Billy, do you want to walk your dog?
No thanks, Mom. I'd rather make out with my robot.
Billy, do you want to get a paper route and earn some extra cash?
No thanks, Dad. I'd rather make out with my robot.
Billy, do you want to come over tonight? We can make out together.
Gee, Mavis, your house is across the street. That's an awfully long way to go for making out.
Now, someone could hear me mention this, how this mechanism for sex could encourage them to get a girlfriend. And they could say, hey, well, isn't the desire for a relationship, isn't the desire for a family, and the impulse for sex different things, right? And I can understand it when they say that. The thing is, through most of human history, they've been the same thing. So by incentivizing one, you incentivize the other. And critically, the parts of the brain that light up when you do one often light up the other. And when the chemicals we pass around for one are the same as some of the chemicals we pass around for the other, they affect each other. Sex and relationship building are not actually isolated from each other. That's a fairly modern conception. It's not true, and I'll get more into that in a minute. So now that our young man is satiated with a cycle of virtual content, he might not be sad. He might feel fine, probably not depressed. He might feel good. He probably feels somewhat similar to a man who has a steady woman. After all, they're both scratching that itch. Although the mechanism in men does reward men who mate with multiple women. After all, we can get multiple women pregnant. It is good for passing on genes. And the porn user will be able to simulate novel women constantly, especially with on-demand streaming videos. So he can give his brain the illusion that he's mating with many women. Now, in the porn-free environment, our current porn user would still feel fine, likely, but he might have a strong urge to engage himself in the type of activities that attract a woman, building himself up, making himself presentable, obtaining resources that could impress a girl. Instead, he feels content, a lack of motivation, no fire to make a change. He's placated. After all, not only does his brain think he's getting some, it thinks he's getting some from potentially many women, right? In such a situation, can you really improve? Now, maybe our young porn user man does want to get a girl. He wants a girlfriend, wants a wife, but that normal fire underneath him, and that was underneath all his male ancestors burning hot, pushing them forward, is doused in a cooling effect of pornography. Have you heard of the herbivore men in Japan? They're really everywhere. Japan and white Western countries not only share the problem of very low birth rates, we're also together in like the top 10 pornography users. It's a pacifier for young men. Young men are often very strong forces in a society. They're often the engines of creation, and they're sometimes the engines of war. Reality is, no matter what you need done, if something needs to be done, you want young, motivated men on your side. Young men have toppled kings. Most revolutionary war soldiers were under 25. 16-year-olds signed up, 15 with your parents' consent. But what if all the young men feel contented? They feel like everything's kind of okay, even if the world around them is burning. That's a bad situation. Now, these pornographers, what are they in the business of? They're kind of in the same business as YouTube, the same business as Facebook, ultimately. Their goal is to get your eyes glued to their website for as long as possible, so they can sell your eyeballs to advertisers. That's what they do. Allrecipes.com does the same thing. They try and get your eyes. by providing a bunch of useful cooking recipes. And if they have enough useful recipes, they get your eyes for longer. But the difference between a recipe website and a pornographic website is that one provides content knowing they're directly playing into addictive cycles by their users, and the other is an information repository trying to get you by having a lot of information and cataloging it and presenting it in useful ways. More or less, that's what those websites do. Now, when I was in high school, I invited another high school kid over for some reason. We didn't hang out regularly. We were kind of in different social circles. I think he was more in the stoner crowd. I don't want to say he was stupid, but, he wasn't exceptional. And I wanted to show him something on the computer, probably a video game. Maybe we were doing a group project. The moment we got to the computer, he immediately asked about porn. And I was surprised because I was like, what? Porn? With me? Another person? I was confused. But ultimately, now that I think back to it, I was likely speaking to someone who had been using porn since puberty. It's kind of like the babies who are born already addicted to a drug. That's really unfortunate. Well, probably with this person, the moment he felt a budding sexuality, he had already been consuming porn. The number of preteens, little kids, watching porn is growing. In the UK, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children showed that about 1/10 of 7th grade children were viewing it regularly. And that's like 12 and 13-year-olds. 94% of the kids who had viewed porn did so when they were 14 or younger. Keep in mind, 10%, that's not all boys, but it's mostly boys. They're getting hit hard. It's probably more like 16% boys, 4% girls, something like that. So I don't know what that guy is doing now, the guy who I invited over to my house, but likely he still uses porn, probably constantly. He's probably addicted to it, and he's probably been addicted to it since he has ever had a sexuality, right? He hasn't known any different. He was a young man responding to urges for the first time in the only way he knew how, right? It's funny, some of the posts I see on Twitter about these young, manipulated, addicted men. Some are casting some pretty harsh judgment on these men, particularly women, and that's kind of how it always is. My advice for you is if you're a man and you have a male problem and you'd like to talk about it and maybe receive any sympathy at all, don't bother talking to women, especially a woman who's never raised sons, because you're never going to get it from them. Almost never, in my experience. In the Journal of Clinical Medicine, they published a paper in January 2019 called Online Porn Addiction, What We Know and What We Don't, a Systematic Review. They talked about a number of things, including how there's been a very sharp increase in erectile dysfunction among young men, and that's normally an old man thing. And it is difficult to link ED to porn, because normally in a study you have to have a control group, right? You'd have your porn users and you have the non-porn user control group. And they're having difficulty actually creating control groups for studies because nearly all young men use porn. It's hard to find a young man who isn't. In the paper, they also mention how porn use is associated with sexual dissatisfaction, sexual dysfunction, increased performance pressure, and just having less sex with real people. And remember what I said? That would make sense. If these porn-using young men didn't have access to porn, it would push them to engage in real-life action with real women. So our prediction sort of makes sense. The fact that porn users are having less real sex with real women just sort of fits, doesn't it? So I'm not going to go through the whole paper, but I will read you their prognosis. Quote, most of the studies reference use subjects with a long-term exposure to online pornography, so its clinical manifestations appear to be direct and proportional consequences of engaging in this maladaptive behavior. And by clinical consequences, or clinical manifestations, they're saying like when the young man goes, "Doctor, doctor, this is happening to me," right? That's the clinical manifestation. So they're continuing, "We mentioned difficulty in obtaining controls to establish causation, but some case reports suggest that reducing or abandoning this behavior may cause improvement in pornography-induced sexual dysfunction and psychosexual dissatisfaction and even full recovery. This would imply that the previously mentioned brain alterations are somewhat reversible." End quote. And that last little bit there about the brain alterations, they're talking about stuff in the neurobiological evidence section. There are brain changes for porn users, and pornographers provide addictive content that alter the lives and the brains of the users in genuinely harmful ways, and they do it for money. Now we need to talk about tradition. And you might say, tradition? Geez, we're switching gears here, aren't we? Yes, but we're going to bring this around back to porn. So tradition is the beliefs, values, and actions held by a people across time, right? So it's culture across time. Traditional values in white Western countries would include individualism, meritocracy, self-reliance. Some of the behaviors would be things like any of the behaviors associated with the nuclear family structure, all the way down to the really basic things like the fact that we celebrate birthdays of children by baking them a cake, and we use a number of candles equal to the age of the child. We use the red rose as a symbol for love. Everything from the really deep to the really shallow, right? That can all be tradition. And in my video, Multiculturalism is a Joke, I use a cultural iceberg analogy that could be useful if you haven't heard this sort of thing before. But culture and tradition is slightly different because culture is what is the beliefs, the values, the actions. Tradition is the ones that are held across time. So tradition at a deep level goes down to beliefs and values. But ultimately, part of the reason why we care about beliefs and values is because when you believe something, it mostly consistently, manifests in your actions. It's not just an isolated behavior like giving someone a red rose. When you believe that meritocracy is good, it informs actions kind of throughout your life all the time. So ultimately, if we look at the actions, if a previous generation did something, we might look back at what they did and say, oh, it wasn't ideal, or it wasn't as good as we think it could have been. But the reality is, whatever they did, it didn't preclude them from living, right? It didn't preclude them from having families and making another generation. So for something to be traditional, by definition, it has to work well enough to not preclude success, right? If you preclude success, it cannot be tradition. If you look at American history, for example, from the early Puritans who came over all the way through the mid-20th century, people have often said that Americans are too prudish. We're too prudish about nudity. We don't like nudity in art. We don't, sex is bad to represent like that. It's a common complaint that's been lodged against us by all sorts of people, Europeans and everyone else has called us prudish. And, maybe theoretically, had the people in the 1940s or the 1840s or the 1740s, had they been slightly less prudish, maybe they would have been happier or something like that. But the reality is, whatever prudishness they did have, they still managed to live, have children, create families. They built the Golden Gate Bridge. They built cities. They created the automobile and made it a huge success. They did a lot of impressive things. Clearly, whatever flaws they had were not great enough to impede them from actually living. So if we chose to live like they did in the 1890s from a traditional perspective, if we decided to hold their beliefs, hold their values, practice as they did, I can't promise you that it would be the best life you could live. I could just promise you that it would work, right? Right? You could have a family. You could have a life, have children. Late 1800s America did not hold a culture that ultimately ended up destroying them. They didn't consume at such a great rate it destroyed them. They didn't prize violence and domination in such a way that ended up precluding them from creating things. They didn't sacrifice all their children to the sun. So at least it worked. Now, Polybius of Greece, he was describing the decline of Greece in the Histories. Quote, "In our time, all Greece has been visited by a dearth of children and a general decay of population, owing to which the cities were denuded of inhabitants and a failure of productiveness resulted. Though there were no long-continued wars or serious pestilences among us, for this evil grew upon us rapidly, and without attracting attention, by our men becoming perverted to a passion for show and money and for the pleasures of an idle life, and accordingly either not marrying at all, or if they did marry, refusing to rear the children that were born, or at most one or two out of a great number, for the sake of leaving them well off, or bringing them up in extravagant luxury." End quote. Polybius described the way people were behaving. He was describing a culture that cannot become tradition, because this way of behaving cannot be done intergenerationally. A culture that becomes impassioned with an idle life and childless wealth can't become tradition because it doesn't pass itself on to the generation it didn't create after it. So again, a tradition cannot prevent the ability to form relationships. It cannot prevent families. And so it can be neutral to families and still become traditions, but something's more likely to become tradition or more likely to be a dominant tradition if it helps promote relationships, if it helps promote the formation of family, and it helps get people most excited about passing on that tradition to their children. Now, I probably should have brought this up earlier, but have you ever heard the word meme? I'm sure you have. Now, meme comes from Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. Now, a meme is a cultural element. It gets transmitted between people. Now, often today, people use the word meme to mean like a popular internet joke or an image macro, but ignoring that, a meme is an idea, a value, or a behavior that we transmit between each other, right? The nuclear family is a meme. A wine aunt is a meme, not just an internet joke, but an actual meme. A dog mom is a meme. Christianity is a whole set of memes. Now, it's a fuzzy set because, let's say, some Christians believe certain things and other Christians would disagree, but there's a lot of overlap between them. Now, so a culture is really just a whole collection of memes, and some memes can become tradition because they don't prevent the host of the meme from forming relationships, from making families. So a wine aunt, that is a meme, but it can never be tradition. A woman will not teach her daughter the way of the wine aunt because wine aunts do not have children. The nuclear family, that's a meme that can become a tradition. An extended family household, that's a meme that can also become tradition, and largely is tradition in non-white countries. Meritocracy, that's a meme, and that became traditional in white Western countries. Nepotism is a tradition for non-whites in non-white countries, but it's also, nepotism is more common even for non-whites in white countries, right? They generally don't adopt meritocracy as tradition even when they move to white countries. They still very much care about their own in-group. They form their own societies, like their own sort of black advocacy groups, Hispanic advocacy groups. If you've heard of La Raza, that means the race, where Hispanics argue for their race and want their good things for their race and advance their race. And, you know, white people don't do the same thing when, let's say, moving to Japan. There's not as much like white the race advocacy. Now, we could look at some of these memes, like nuclear families versus extended families, meritocracy versus nepotism, and we could argue about them. But the reality is, at least all of those are capable of being a tradition, right? Self-indulgent individuals who are consumed with the idea of living in childless wealth, that can't become tradition because it precludes intergenerational passing on, right? So this is ultimately an evolutionary model. Memes exist, they can mutate, they can become something new, they go through a selection process in every generation. That which is successful in making sure people live and make families is fit and may become tradition. That which prevents people from living, prevents people from making families, cannot become tradition long term. So, for example, severe anorexia is unlikely to ever become tradition because even if it were to become popular in a culture, severe anorexia often leaves people infertile. Memes can't just keep you barely alive. They need to keep you alive and at least well enough physically and mentally motivated to start families. So now, if you've never heard this understanding of memes, you can Google memetics. It's kind of like genetics. So a traditionalist is someone who generally wants to preserve established traditions, maybe not 100%, but the vast majority, and they may also want to revive lost traditions. That would be a traditionalist. A traditionalist could be viewed simply with like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. A more nuanced view would be like, hey, this has worked. If you want to argue about what has worked and try and get us to do something that we don't know if it'll work, then you need to give us really compelling reasons before we should ever move from what has worked, right? So they might not stonewall any change, but they view change skeptically because you might be taking someone out of the frying pan and into the fire with your improvement. For anti-traditionalists, they'll take a couple different positions. Either a more sophisticated position, they may have a radical idea about how humans should be. They're trying to reinvent the wheel here. They've tapped into the universe. They see how we should really live in a new and novel way. And some of these ideas are sophisticated. They're compelling. Some are interesting. I like to enjoy entertaining these ideas in my head. If I had all the money in the world, I might even consider sponsoring tests of some of these ideas about the way people should live. Keep in mind, if we ever become a spacefaring species, our traditions might be radically different in very different environments, like a spacefaring species might experience, so it might be worth testing some of those now. Now, there's also the sort of less sophisticated anti-traditionalist take. It's me no like traditions. Why should I have to remain a virgin before marriage? That's stupid. I don't like that. Tradition's bad, right? This isn't really proposing anything new. They're kind of just railing against the old ways. They feel put upon by the old ways. When I was making this video, someone replied by saying, tradition is outdated and it just limits us. That's more of a type 2 anti-traditionalist. They're advocating against tradition because me no like. Saying tradition is outdated doesn't make any sense. That's kind of like saying shoes are worn out. Well, shoes categorically aren't worn out. Some shoes are worn out, but some shoes are brand new. Some of our tradition maybe needs to be revised, but other of it is probably still very relevant and very good. So to say tradition itself is outdated, it's kind of a brainlet take. So now what has happened in the West? Well, for one, we've become significantly less Christian. A Christian worldview, a Christian viewpoint is essentially a whole collection of memes. It's a fuzzy set. It's a big net of memes or a big blanket of memes all sewed together. And you have everything from the very specific beliefs about God to the more general sort of behavioral things like God wants you to engage in this behavior, so do it, right? And as people stopped being Christians in the West, which has happened to a large degree, they've dropped some of the other memes, right? They stopped being reminded that coveting their neighbor is harmful to them. As people stopped being Christians, they stopped believing that remaining a virgin before marriage is a good thing. These two memes are kind of tied together. The notion that remaining a virgin before marriage pleases God sort of only matters if you actually believe that the God exists, so you want to do things at his behest. Now, we know statistically virgins have stable marriages about 80 to 90% of the time in most studies. I'm showing you a graph here on the screen. This is using data from the National Center for Health Statistics. This is the National Survey for Family Growth. It shows that 80% of women who were virgins at marriage are in stable marriages. Once they've had one premarital partner, that drops to 53%. For women who have had 15 or more sexual partners before marriage, it drops down to like 20% stable marriages. Now, that's a complete reversal. That's like 80% success to 80% failure Women who have no premarital sexual partners report higher happiness, 56% for no premarital sex, 46%, that's a 10% drop for just one premarital sexual partner. Once they're over 15 sexual partners, it's down to 33% or less. And the reality is here that sex is a pair bonding experience. Take a piece of tape, stick it to the wall. It's bonded to the wall. Remove the tape, stick it to a new wall. The bond's a little bit weaker. Do it again. Pull it off that wall, put it on a new wall. Pull it off, put it on a new wall. Put it off, put it on a new wall. Eventually, the tape doesn't really bond to anything. Well, that's kind of how sex works in humans. Do you remember when I said sex and relationship building wasn't two totally separate things? Well, this is it. Sex is a relationship bonding experience, not just a sexual experience. It's a relational experience. Having premarital sexual partners prevents some amount of long-term bonding. So the modern person who wants to totally separate sex from relationships, that it's I'm not saying they're bad. They see in themselves their desire for sex, and they also have a desire for, let's say, a relationship or family. And those two desires feel very different, right? So it's not that crazy to assume that those are two totally separate mechanisms. So when they hear that I'm talking like I am, talking about how sex and relationships are so connected and they're almost the same thing in many ways, it's reasonable when they say, hey, aren't I conflating two separate issues? I understand why they would come to that conclusion, but they're not aware of the science. The human biological animal doesn't work that way. Sex and relationships are somewhat one thing. They happen with some of the same chemicals in the same parts of the brain. You can't separate these two things as I have a sexual life and a relational life, or a sexual life and a familial life. Those are partly the same. So this meme of virginity was very important, and it existed in Christianity. It was a good thing, and it sort of got tossed out as people became less Christian. And here's where we bring it back to pornography. Some people may have been told as children, right, to previous generations, that masturbation was bad, pornography was bad. They may have been told various theological reasons for it. Maybe it was wicked in God's eyes when Onan spilled his seed on the ground. But whatever the theological justification is, the meme itself of shunning masturbation and pornography was a good one, and it was eschewed when people became less Christian. I mean, who cares about what God wants if you don't believe that he wants things or that he's there? So when I was growing up, I was fairly unlikely to hear a lot of these memes. I certainly didn't hear about any statistics in health class about how premarital sex inversely correlated with marital stability. I didn't hear about how pornography use adversely affected young men. I was more likely to hear things like wear a condom and a snarky remark about how every hole is a goal. So if you're not a Christian, but you are a traditionalist, you would say something like, well, clearly the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. This Christian net of memes had a lot of high quality memes in it, and you don't have to be a Christian just to see that. And I think maybe this is where some Christians are coming from when they accuse a non-believer of rejecting God because they don't want to keep his rules. You're just rebelling against him. They're saying you reject the very explicitly Christian memes because the associated memes they cramp your style. I don't want to remain a virgin. I want to be a whore, whatever. But ultimately, not coveting your neighbor's house or wife or any of his belongings, that's a good meme. Abstaining from porn is a good meme. Remaining a virgin before marriage, that's a good meme. People who remain virgins before marriage have better marriages. They have more kids. They have happy kids who are likely to follow their parents' footsteps. Just look at the Amish and the Mormons. Their birth rates are among the highest, and they're above replacement. That's tradition. Tradition is memes that have survived the natural selection process through generations. Another meme is meeting every week in your community to come together in thoughtful discussion and spending time after to catch up, connect, network. It's a good thing. It's facilitated community building. Is it really a surprise that we're starting to see atheist churches pop up in places like Seattle? I mean, someone has realized that the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. If there's an atheist who's like, wait a second, this whole church thing was really good. That's their perspective. Now, keep in mind, Christianity has been morphing a lot, especially recently. Many Christian meme nets are not nearly as traditional as they used to be. The official Catholic Church stance is not that great. Surveys on Catholics in the United States do not show them to be very traditional. Different Christian groups have kept or abandoned traditional values to varying degrees. If you were to show up to a random church, they might have, invited a drag queen to preach at the church. So sometimes you'll see online Christians, they'll tell young people, well, just go to church. That's your path to a healthy life. Well, a lot of those churches aren't handing out the same, nets as they used to. All right, so the idea that porn, among many other things, is harming us more because we lost our traditional Christian meme nets is what I'm talking about. The fact that the De-Christianization of white Western countries plus anti-traditionalists being more common in the churches, at the same time that we've seen a lot of development in easily accessible online video pornography, in even VHS and DVDs back when that was common, this has all sort of lined up to be a disaster for young men. Had not all of those things happened at the same time, we might be able to find non-porn users to be in control groups for scientific studies, right? So I'm going to finish this by reading you a passage from a book. Now, it's called At Any Cost by Peter Tangvald. And Peter Tangvald is kind of like a personal hero of mine. And if you know him, that might surprise you because he's not a very traditional guy. He wasn't a very responsible guy. He was a race mixer. I made that video against race mixing. But, hey, we all have flaws. I have had plenty of friends and heroes and family members who aren't perfect. In fact, they've all been imperfect. I don't expect perfection from people. And he lived a very exciting life. So in this book, he talks about how he likes to uphold old superstitions. He's sailed across the world. He spent his life on the ocean. And sailors have a ton of superstitions. You never whistle on a boat. Women are bad luck on boats. You never leave a port on a Friday. You don't kill an albatross. Those are the souls of lost sailors. But he's got a good perspective on this. In chapter 9, he's in a port with his pregnant wife in the Red Sea. When we awoke the next morning, we found the anchorage rolly, disagreeable, and crowded. Already we were being pestered by one bum boat after another. Since we were also far behind schedule, there was no reason to delay departure. No reason except, that is, that this was Friday, and any seaman knows that it's bad luck to leave a harbor on a Friday. Of course, it's ridiculous to believe in such silly, old-fashioned superstitions, but then one never knows, so why take unnecessary risks? In all my life, I don't think I've ever departed on a Friday, and I was loath to start now, but Lydia, being a fervent Christian, frowned upon my belief in such, quote, tales of the devil, end quote, and insisted that was absolutely no reason to delay our departure and to waste time in that dreary anchorage. Even superstitious people will generally admit that if we're willing to think about it coldly and logically, superstitious beliefs are not worthy of intelligent and civilized men. Yet I've long been intrigued about how such superstitious laws and beliefs came about, and have wondered, secretly, if there weren't some truth to them. Little by little, I've reached the conclusion that, in many such cases, these silly beliefs were not so silly after all, and we would be wise to take our warnings from them. Surprisingly, the statistics do show that ships leaving on Friday run into trouble more often than ships leaving on any other day of the week. How can such a fact jibe with superstition? Simply because ships leaving on Friday all too often were not as well prepared as they should have been. The skipper rushed through her loading or her fitting out, or had disregarded the approach of bad weather, all in an effort to avoid laying over in port during the weekend, which would have cost him money, time, and perhaps a drunken crew. Logic, in this case, as in so many others, fits in with the superstitious rule which resulted from it. Likewise, there's an old belief that it's bad luck for a ship and its crew to have a woman on board. In fact, many sailors would refuse to board a ship with a woman on board. Silly? Yet, statistically, such ships did run into trouble more often than ships without any women on board. Why? I can easily imagine at least one example. Suppose the skipper brings his wife with him. Perhaps she comes along mainly to please him without really liking the sea, but hoping for a pleasant cruise. Then the weather becomes bad, and soon the ship is hove to in a very heavy sea. Madame becomes seasick and frightened, and begs her husband to make for the safety of the closest port. The skipper knows the danger of trying to make some ports in gale conditions, but the moaning of his wife and her discomfort is more than he can stand. So he tries to make for port against his better judgment. Many ships have been lost trying to enter a port under unfavorable conditions, rather than riding it out safely at sea. But how is he to explain that to his wife? And how could it possibly bring bad luck to a ship to have a man whistle on board? Ridiculous superstition? I would say no, for two reasons. Whistling can get fellow crew members and officers' nerves so on edge they can no longer work the ship properly and may get the ship in trouble, or crew members who get irritated or upset by that whistling might find it tiring or difficult to ask or order the whistler to stop that annoying habit. It was much easier to spread the rumor that it brings bad luck, and thus everyone had peace. Others are more obvious, like the belief that it brings bad luck to walk under a ladder or a scaffold. Indeed, the chances of getting splashed with paint or having a tool fall on one's head must be greater than if we take the trouble to walk around those obstacles. As for the belief that it's bad luck to light more than 2 cigarettes with the same match, everybody knows that during World War I, the flare-up of a match in the darkness of night would have burned long enough by the 3rd cigarette to give the enemy time to aim and shoot. Thus I argued with Lydia. Superstitious laws were not dictated by evil, but by clear logic, and we should perhaps follow most of these rules, remembering there's no smoke without fire. But I reluctantly admitted that my explanation for not leaving on a Friday didn't concern us in this case. Yet I must have wanted to play it safe. Instead of writing on my logbook, leaving today, I wrote continuing voyage, which had started on any other day but Friday. A bit childish, I suppose, and apparently not sufficient to fool fate. I can't help shivering when rereading my log today. I see Lydia's untimely and tragic death 3 years later happened exactly on the same date, at the same hour, to the minute of our departure, both at 10 a.m. on February 20th. Just a coincidence, of course, but there are stranger things under the sun than the mind can comprehend. So that's from the book At Any Cost. Sometimes our traditions, even our little superstitions, even if we're not sure why they would be helpful, sometimes they are. They can help keep us safe. They can help keep our relationships happy and working smoothly. They can even keep us in better balance with internal mechanism, like driving men to find a mate with real women. Thanks for listening. If you feel like any of my videos have been useful, or they have a good message, or I've presented the message in a compelling way, please share my videos with anyone who you think they might be helpful too. I'm on BitChute as well.